Here, we'll go over an overview of trophic dynamics. Energy and nutrient transfers define the trophic structure of ecosystems. If we take a look back at the beginning, or when we first started to define trophic dynamics in ecosystems, the models look something like this. We had pools, and these pools were organisms, and there were flexes among organisms. So for example, Ray Lindemann's food web of Cedar Bog Lake started with essentially phytoplankton, so small plants that were eaten by zooplankton, small animals, that then were consumed by these plankton predators, zooplanktivores, and then by swimming predators, essentially fish. So when you took a look, here was a chain of interactions by which energy was fixed, materials were taken up, and they were transferred among organisms by the process of consumption. There was another parallel chain of interactions where pondweeds, so actual larger plants, were produced and then consumed by browsers, often insects. These might be consumed by other predators, and then fish would eat those. And you can see that it was complicated as far as what the actual consumption pathways were. In the end, everything would go down to the sediments and be decomposed, often by what was called bacteria here. These would have released dissolved nutrients into the water that would then be taken up by different plants again. So in this case, we had a chain of interactions and then cycling through a detrital web also. This is probably one of the simpler sets of food web diagrams, but it gets at some of the basics of how we think of trophic interactions working. And what was set up in 1942 is still basically followed today. Now for this chapter, there's actually a lot of terminology, and I'll go over some of that specifically here. First is trophic transfers. And when we talk about trophic transfers, essentially what we mean here is the feeding by one organism on another or on dead organic matter. So these transfers are going to be of energy and material, and they're going to go from one organism to another. And this pathway really needs to be on a feeding basis. The whole organism does not need to be consumed. A portion of it can be consumed, but it has to be what we can generally consider to be feeding in one form or another. We're also going to talk about autotrophs. And autotrophs are those organisms that are able to reduce carbon dioxide, to convert carbon dioxide and water, solar energy into biomass. So generally we're thinking about plants. And then we have heterotrophs, and heterotrophs derive their energy by eating live or dead organic matter. So in this case, heterotrophs are often animals consuming plants, or animals consuming other animals, or all those different organisms that then decompose plants or animals. Among the heterotrophs, we're going to talk about consumers, and these are organisms that eat other live organisms. And then herbivores are those animals that consume plants. We'll also use the term detritivore, and detritus is essentially dead organic matter, and detritivores gain their energy material by eating generally dead organisms. There's also microbivores, which are those organisms that consume microbes. And then we'll talk about carnivores, and carnivores is a generic term for animals that consume other animals. Lastly, we have the idea of omnivore, and these are organisms that cannot be classified into just one of those categories. So they're organisms that would consume plants or animals, for example, in the most basic dichotomy. Classic omnivore would be a bear, for example, which are known to eat meat, so in this case salmon. But bears also consume plants, such as these berries, and their diet varies over the course of the season. In addition, bears are also known to eat honey, and it's actually even somewhat difficult to classify what honey is as far as plants or animals are concerned. It's a regurgitated food product of bees, so it's nectar that's been regurgitated into the form of honey. So we've got bears that are going to consume meat, and so they're going to eat animals. They're also going to consume plants, and then they also consume some things that are relatively unclassifiable, like honey. When we talk about the connections among organisms, as far as trophic dynamics are concerned, we often will talk about a food chain. And the food chain is a transfer of energy and materials among a set of organisms. And it's a pretty simplified set of relationships. Often when we do these food chains, we're actually going to associate them vertically. So these would be our plants here, and they're going to be consumed by herbivores, and then carnivores. So in this sense, we'll often array the chain of interactions, plants to herbivores to consumers, vertically, with plants on the bottom, herbivores, and consumers above them. So that's a food chain. Think of it just like a chain where you have pool, flux, pool, flux, pool. And it's a very simplified diagram. Now, in contrast to food chains, we'll often talk about food webs. And food webs are essentially interconnected food chains. So when we take a look at the organisms, you would often will lump plants into just one if we're talking about a food chain, but we know that there's a lot of different species of plants there too. And then as far as herbivores are consumed, there can be lots of different herbivores that at different times are consuming different plants. And then for the carnivores, this is also patterns that look something like this. And so they're interconnected chains. It's more complicated. Each of these arrows is going to differ in size, for example. But the relationships among organisms and the transfer of energy materials is actually a lot more complicated than a simple diagram that's a food chain. So for a real world example, for somewhere like Kanza Prairie where I work, we can have grass at the bottom. And these would be our autotrophs, using the terminology we've been talking about. And then grass can be consumed by bison. And bison are heterotrophics, and they're herbivores. And then some bison, for example, might be consumed by coyotes or wolves. And in that sense, we have our consumers, which are also heterotrophs. And they're carnivores, because they primarily eat meat, at least in this case. So we have grass, bison, coyote arranged in a food chain, going from autotrophs to heterotrophs, from producers to consumers, from herbivores and also carnivores. Now, even the simplest of food webs can become really complex. This here is figure 10.3, and it's a pattern of energy flow through below ground portions of a grassland food web. And as you can see, that the food webs can consist of many interconnecting food chains. So we can set up a food chain, for example, that's going to start with something like detritus that goes through earthworms. That's not a good example because apparently earthworms are not eaten by anything here. So we'll do detritus, which are then consumed by fungi. Fungi are consumed by mites, and then they're taken up by predaceous mites. And so that would be a food chain within a larger food web.